You open your eyes. It's dark. Not the kind of dark you're used to. Not the soft, comfortable dark of a bedroom with blackout curtains, where the faint glow of a phone charger still winks at you from across the room. This is different. This is total. Absolute. A darkness so complete, it feels like something alive pressing against your face. You can't see your hand in front of you. You can't see anything, and then the smell hits you. It's hard to put into words. Imagine every unpleasant odor you've ever encountered. The gym locker room, a gas station bathroom on a summer highway, a trash bag left too long in the August heat. And now imagine that's just the air. That's just outside. That's the baseline. That's Tuesday. You hear something. A low, guttural sound from nearby. An animal, maybe, or a person. You genuinely cannot tell. Somewhere in the distance, something is burning. You don't know if that's good news or bad news yet. In the Middle Ages, it could absolutely be either. You have been transported, call it a glitch in the universe, a cruel joke by a time-traveling deity, a very poorly designed escape room, to somewhere in medieval Europe. Let's say around the 14th century, and you have until dawn to survive. Spoiler alert, you are not going to make it. Not because you're weak, not because you're stupid, but because the medieval world is a place that has been specifically, almost artistically engineered to destroy someone exactly like you. Someone from the modern era. Someone who grew up with antibiotics, indoor plumbing, electric lights, and the basic expectation that drinking water shouldn't kill you. Everything you take for granted. Every invisible comfort. Every background assumption about how the world works is about to be stripped away. One brutal layer at a time. This is not a story about knights and castles and romantic banquets with roasted boar. Those exist, sure, but you won't be anywhere near them. You'll be in the mud, in the dark, cold, confused, and completely out of your depth. So let's walk through your night, step by step, minute by minute. Let's trace exactly where things go wrong and why, so that by the time the sun comes up, assuming you last that long, you'll understand something that history books rarely bother to say out loud. The Middle Ages were genuinely, extraordinarily, spectacularly horrible to live through. Buckle up. Chapter 1. The darkness that wants to kill you. Let's start with the most immediate problem. You cannot see. In the modern world, darkness is a temporary inconvenience. You stub your toe on the way to the bathroom at 2 a.m. You curse quietly. You flip a switch. Done. Problem solved. Even in a power outage, you've got a phone with a flashlight app. Candles somewhere. Maybe one of those sad emergency lanterns from the camping gear you bought 3 years ago and never used. In medieval Europe, there is none of that. When the sun goes down, it goes down. The world does not glow softly with ambient light pollution. There are no street lamps, no lit windows from neighboring apartments, no distant highway casting an orange haze across the sky. It is simply, profoundly, categorically dark. And this is not a minor quality of life issue. This is a survival issue. Think about what you can't do in total darkness. You can't navigate. You can't identify threats. You can't find food or water or shelter. You can't tell if the sound you just heard was a dog, a wild boar, or the person who's about to rob you. And in the medieval world, all four of those are genuinely possible. Torches existed, obviously. Candles existed, but they were expensive. Tallow candles, the cheap kind, made from rendered animal fat, smelled awful, burned unevenly, gave off a disappointing amount of light, and still cost money that most people didn't have in abundance. Beeswax candles were better, but they were a luxury item. You weren't getting those unless you were somebody important, which you're not. You just arrived. So you're standing in the dark, and the first mistake you're probably going to make is try to move. Don't. Seriously, do not move. The medieval landscape at night is a complete and utter obstacle course. Roads, and I use that term generously, are not the smooth, even reflective surfaces you're accustomed to. They are rutted dirt tracks, often inches deep in mud depending on the season. They have no lighting, no signage, no lane markings, no guardrails. They frequently run right alongside open drainage ditches, not quaint little decorative ditches. We're talking deep, foul-smelling channels of wastewater, animal refuse, and the general biological output of an entire community. Fall into one of those in the dark, and you're going to have a very bad night before the night has even really started. Beyond the roads, the landscape itself is genuinely threatening after dark. Forests, and there are a lot of forests covering far more of Europe than you'd imagine, are places where things live, real things. Wolves are not a fairy tale in medieval Europe. They are a documented, persistent, actual problem. Packs of them. They are active at night. They are hungry. And they are not scared of you, because you are a small, slow, completely defenseless creature, standing in the dark, making confused noises. Wild boar are also out there. And wild boar are one of those animals that history has consistently underrated as a threat. They're fast, they're aggressive, and they have tusks that can open you up like a letter. Medieval hunters in full armor respected wild boar. You, in whatever you're wearing, are considerably less prepared. Bears existed in much of medieval Europe too, though their range varied, but you didn't need bears to be in immediate danger. You just needed it to be dark. You needed to be lost, and you needed the medieval world to be the medieval world. So you stand still. Smart move. You take stock of your situation. You're cold, possibly very cold, depending on the season. And this is another thing modern people massively underestimate about the past: the cold. We think of cold as an annoyance, a reason to grab a jacket. In the medieval world, cold, specifically, a cold night without adequate shelter or clothing, is a legitimate mortal threat. Hypothermia doesn't care how brave you are or how much you want to survive. It lowers your core body temperature, it makes you confused, it makes you sleepy, it makes you stop shivering, which is actually a very bad sign, and then it kills you while you're unconscious, quietly, without drama. And before you say, well, I'll just find shelter, we'll get to that. Finding shelter is not as straightforward as it sounds. In fact, we're going to spend a good amount of time on that particular disaster. But first, the sounds. Because the medieval night has a soundtrack, and it's not a comforting one. There are animals everywhere. This is a world before the aggressive domestication and management of the countryside that later centuries would bring. The wildlife is abundant, loud, and close. Owls, foxes, dogs, and by dogs, I don't mean friendly, neutered, well-fed pets. I mean semi-wild working animals that are territorial, suspicious of strangers, and entirely capable of biting you with considerable enthusiasm. There are also people out at night. And here's the thing about medieval people out at night. If they're out at night, that's suspicious. And not just suspicious to you, suspicious to them. Medieval towns and villages had curfews, literal curfews. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, cover the fire. It referred to the nightly signal, often a bell, that told everyone to damp their hearth fires, a fire safety measure in a world where everything was made of wood and thatch, and get off the streets. Being out after curfew was, at best, something you had to explain to the night watch. At worst, it was enough to get you arrested, detained, or beaten, depending on the jurisdiction and the mood of whoever found you. The night watch existed in towns. These were not friendly, helpful public servants. They were not going to ask if you were okay and helpfully direct you to a shelter. They were looking for troublemakers, thieves, and suspicious strangers wandering around after curfew. You are, at this exact moment, all three of those things simultaneously. You are a suspicious stranger. You are out after curfew. And the moment you open your mouth and the words that come out are a version of English that won't be spoken for another 600 years, the situation is going to deteriorate rapidly. Let's talk about that, actually. Language. Even if you find someone helpful, you cannot communicate with them in any meaningful way. The English you speak, modern English, with its standardized spelling, its borrowed vocabulary from centuries of immigration and trade, its simplified grammar, is completely unrecognizable to someone from medieval England. Middle English, the language of Chaucer, looks like a foreign language to most modern native English speakers. Old English, from the earlier medieval period, is genuinely a different language. If you somehow wound up in France, Italy, Germany, forget it entirely. You are functionally mute, and being functionally mute in a world that already views strangers with deep suspicion is not a great starting position. So it's dark, it's cold, you can't see, you can't communicate, and moving around is actively dangerous. What do? You wait. You try not to die from exposure. You look for any indication of fire. Not because fire is safe, but because where there's fire, there's people. And where there's people, there might be warmth, even if getting to that warmth comes with its own complicated risks. And as you stand there in the dark, shivering slightly, trying to orient yourself by sound alone, you start to realize something about the medieval world that no history class ever quite conveyed. It is relentlessly, exhaustingly hostile to human life. Not because of any particular villain, not because of a war, or a plague, or a famine, though all of those are happening somewhere, always, but just as a baseline condition. The medieval world is not set up for your comfort. It is not set up for anyone's comfort, really. It is a world where the margin between surviving and not is thin, where every single system that you depend on without thinking, clean water, safe food, medical care, reliable shelter, physical security, simply does not exist in any form you'd recognize. And you've been here for maybe 20 minutes. It's going to be a long night. Chapter 2. Shelter. The places you can't stay. Let's say you spot a light, a distant flicker, maybe a torch, or a fire through a crack in a door. You move toward it carefully, shuffling really, because the ground is uneven and you cannot afford to twist an ankle, which, in the medieval world, is a much more serious problem than it sounds. You find a building, several actually, a cluster of low structures, a village, or the outskirts of one, and for a brief, hopeful moment, you think, okay, shelter. I just need to get inside somewhere warm, and I can figure the rest out from there. Here's where your next set of assumptions about the world are going to get you into trouble. Let's start with what a medieval peasant's home actually looks like, because when most people picture a medieval cottage, they picture something charming. Thatched roof, sure. Exposed beams, a fireplace, maybe some bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling. Rustic but cozy, the kind of place where you'd drink warm cider and pet a friendly dog. The reality is somewhat different. A typical peasant dwelling in medieval Europe. And we're talking about the overwhelming majority of the population here, because medieval society was something like 90% agricultural peasantry, was small, very small, a single room often, or maybe two. Built with whatever materials were locally available, timber framing, wattle and daub walls. That's a lattice of sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, animal dung, straw, and whatever else came to hand. And yes, a thatched roof. The floor was dirt, often literally just the earth, packed down. In better situations, there might be rushes laid down, dried grass or reed, but those rushes accumulated everything that fell on them. Food scraps, animal waste, mud, spilled liquid, dead insects. They were changed occasionally, but occasionally in a pre-modern household means not nearly as often as you're imagining. And speaking of animals, there might be animals inside the house, not as pets, as livestock. Keeping pigs, chickens, or a goat inside, especially in winter, served a dual purpose. It kept the animals from freezing, which would represent a devastating economic loss, and the animal's body heat contributed to warming the space. This was practical. This was logical. This was also extraordinarily unhygienic by any measurable standard, and the smell would make your eyes water. There is no chimney in the earliest medieval homes. There's a hearth, a fire in the middle of or along one wall. And the smoke goes up and hopefully finds its way out through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. This means the interior of the home is perpetually smoky. The walls are stained with it. The ceiling beams are black with it. Everyone inside breathes it constantly, every day and night. Medieval peasants had respiratory issues at rates that would be considered a public health emergency today. Their lungs, when examined by archaeologists, look like those of heavy smokers, even when the individuals never touched tobacco, which hadn't arrived in Europe yet anyway. So you're cold, you find a building, you go inside, and you are immediately enveloped in smoke, animal smell, unwashed human smell, and the general aromatic output of a family who has never in their lives heard the concept of ventilation. But at least it's warm. Marginally. And that's something. Except, and here's the problem, it's not your house. And the people inside know that. You open a door, or a gap covered by a piece of cloth or hide, and the people inside look at you. And you look at them. Medieval peasants were not naive about strangers. They were not cartoonishly suspicious, mostly, but they lived in a world where hospitality had a very specific transactional character. The concept of hospitality, offering shelter and food to travelers, was genuinely important in medieval culture, tied up with Christian duty and social obligation. So there's a decent chance they won't immediately slam the door in your face. There's even a chance they might gesture you inside and offer you a corner to sit in. But here's what they're also thinking. Who is this person? Where are they from? Do they have the authority to be here? Because in a feudal world, movement is not free. Peasants were often legally tied to the land, serfs, villains, and a stranger wandering in from nowhere without explanation was immediately suspect. Could be a runaway serf, could be a fugitive, could be a spy for a rival lord, could be a carrier of disease, could be a thief casing the house while pretending to need shelter, and you cannot explain yourself. You don't speak their language. You gesture. They gesture back, probably. Maybe someone makes the universal sign for sit down. You sit. Someone hands you something. And here, in the warmth and the smoke and the general biological miasma of a medieval peasant home, your problems are just beginning. Let's talk about what you've been handed. Because you're hungry and thirsty, and you've been standing in the cold dark for an hour, and whatever has been placed in front of you, some kind of bowl, probably clay or wood, containing something liquid and brownish, looks incredibly appealing right now. Do not drink the water. I cannot stress this enough. Do not drink any water that hasn't been boiled, and even then, be cautious. The medieval understanding of disease transmission is essentially zero. The germ theory of disease won't be developed for centuries. Nobody in this room has any idea that microscopic organisms in water can kill you. They have no concept of sanitation in any modern sense. The water source for this village might be downstream from where the animals drink and defecate. It might be downstream from the communal waste disposal. It might be the same source used for everything, and its quality varies from unpleasant to genuinely dangerous, depending on the season and local conditions. Waterborne illness was one of the great silent killers of the Middle Ages. Dysentery, typhoid fever, various forms of gastroenteritis. These were facts of life. People got sick from water all the time. They just didn't know why, and they attributed it to bad air. Miasma, divine punishment, imbalances in the four humors, or sometimes witchcraft. The idea that the thing you drank made you sick because of tiny living creatures in it simply did not exist as a concept. If you get dysentery tonight, and it's a real possibility depending on what you eat or drink, you're going to experience one of the most unpleasant medical conditions imaginable without access to any effective treatment. Fluids, rest, and antibiotics are the modern treatment. You have none of those. People died of dysentery regularly. It killed armies. It was a completely normal cause of death for medieval adults and children alike. So what can you drink? Ale. Maybe wine, if you're in the right part of Europe. The brewing process kills the pathogens. Medieval people including children, drank ale fairly regularly for exactly this reason. Not because they were all alcoholics, but because the fermentation process made it safer than the water. The alcohol content was often relatively low, what we'd call small ale, so it wasn't like everyone was stumbling around drunk. It was just safer than water. If someone hands you ale, drink it slowly and gratefully. It might be your best medical decision of the evening. Now, the bowl of brownish liquid, what is it? It's probably pottage. This is the defining food of the medieval peasant, the meal that appears on tables, or more often, the single flat surface serving as a table, day after day after day. Pottage is, at its most basic, a thick stew made from whatever is available: grains, legumes, root vegetables, herbs, sometimes a small amount of meat or fat for flavor. It can be quite nutritious, actually. Medieval peasants weren't always malnourished in the simple sense. They often got adequate calories, but the variety was limited in ways that led to specific deficiencies, and the preparation and storage of food carried its own risks. Depending on the season and the prosperity of the household, your pottage might contain oats or barley, dried peas or beans, turnips or parsnips or onions, possibly some cabbage. Maybe a bone that's been boiled for flavor. Maybe some salt, which was genuinely valuable. Maybe some herbs. It might be quite good, in a hearty, filling, one-note sort of way. Or it might be made from grain that's been stored a bit too long, in conditions that weren't ideal, and has begun to develop mold. And here's where we need to talk about ergot. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and other grains under certain damp storage conditions. It produces a compound called ergotamine, which is chemically related to LSD. When people consumed significant quantities of ergot-contaminated grain, which happened regularly in medieval Europe, they experienced a condition called ergotism, also known as St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were, to put it mildly, alarming: burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, hallucinations. In the gangrenous form, the blood vessels constrict so severely that limbs lose circulation, turn black, and fall off. Medieval communities experiencing ergot outbreaks often interpreted what they were seeing as demonic possession, supernatural punishment, or witchcraft, which is part of why some historians link certain witch trial panics and alleged mass possessions to ergot contamination of the local grain supply. You probably won't get ergot poisoning tonight from a single meal. But the point is, the food you're eating exists in a world with no food safety regulations, no refrigeration, no understanding of microbiology, and no consistent means of distinguishing this grain is fine from this grain. Has been colonized by a hallucinogenic fungus. You eat, it's warm, you're grateful, and you try not to think too hard about what might be in it. Now let's talk about where you're going to sleep, because you are exhausted, and the fire in the hearth is burning low, and the family has stopped paying attention to you, and there is absolutely no guest bedroom. There is no separate sleeping space at all, in all likelihood. Everyone sleeps in the same room. The family members are arranged on rough sleeping pallets, straw stuffed into sacking, or just piles of straw, on the floor or on low wooden platforms. If you're lucky, someone gestures at a corner and you curl up on the rushes. The same rushes that have been accumulating food particles and biological material for weeks. The same rushes that are, as you will discover almost immediately, hosting a thriving ecosystem. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, possibly mice. In the modern world, these are pests. In the medieval world, they are permanent house guests. Everyone has them. Everyone. The most elevated nobleman in his castle, the bishop in his palace, the king on his throne, all of them have lice. It's not a reflection of personal hygiene habits, though those are also not great, but we'll get to that. It's simply a baseline condition of human existence before the modern era. Lice and fleas were facts of life, the way traffic jams are facts of life now. Annoying, unavoidable, something you deal with and move on from. Except that fleas in the 14th century are not just annoying. They are the mechanism by which the Black Death spreads. We'll get to the Black Death. Oh, we'll definitely get to the Black Death. But even setting aside the apocalyptic plague for a moment, flea bites and lice have their own problems. Lice transmit typhus, epidemic typhus, a serious bacterial infection that causes high fever, rash, confusion, and has a historically significant fatality rate. Fleas can transmit plague, obviously, but also murine typhus and other bacterial infections. You lie down in the rushes, in the smoke-stained room, next to the family and possibly their goat, and within minutes, the itching begins. Your skin, accustomed to the relatively pest-free environment of the modern world, is being introduced to a community of organisms that would like to eat you. You scratch more. You're not going to sleep, but it's warm, and you're not in the dark and the cold anymore. By medieval standards, this is actually going pretty okay. Here's something that keeps you awake, though. The sound from the next village. Or maybe it's this village. Maybe it's just around the corner. A bell ringing in the dark. And then voices, shouting maybe, or chanting. You can't tell. And the family around you stirs, murmurs, but doesn't seem alarmed. You will learn, if you survive long enough to piece things together, what that sound likely was. It might have been the church bell marking the canonical hours, the regular intervals of prayer that structured medieval time, matins around midnight, lauds before dawn. The church divided the night as well as the day, and monastic communities and parish churches, trying to echo that structure, rang bells at each hour. The sound of bells at night was not alarming. It was normal. It was actually, in a deeply disorienting way, reassuring, a sign that the world was ordered, that time was passing, that the church was awake, even if you were trying not to be. But it's loud, and it keeps happening. The medieval world is full of bells, and medieval people slept differently than you do. This is another thing that doesn't make it into most history books. Sleep in the pre-modern era was not the single, consolidated 8-hour block that modern medicine endorses. Many historians, following the research of Roger E. Kirch, believe that pre-industrial humans commonly practiced what's called segmented sleep, 2 distinct sleep periods with a period of wakefulness in between, sometimes lasting an hour or two. During this watch, or first waking, people would pray, tend the fire, check on animals, talk quietly, or in some documented cases, visit neighbors. This is not insomnia. This was normal. This is how humans slept before artificial light reshaped our circadian rhythms into the monophasic sleep pattern we now consider natural. You, though, are used to sleeping straight through. And between the cold, the smoke, the fleas, the bells, and the low-grade, existential terror of having been dropped into the wrong century, you're not sleeping at all. You're lying in the dark, the perpetual, impenetrable medieval dark, staring at a ceiling you can't see, listening to sounds you can't interpret, trying to remember the last time you were this uncomfortable. And it's only midnight. The worst is still ahead of you. Chapter 3. Your body is a disaster waiting to happen. Let's check in on you physically. You've been in the medieval world for a few hours now. You're lying on a floor that's trying to eat you alive, one flea bite at a time. Your eyes are stinging from the smoke. Your throat is dry. You took a cautious sip of the ale someone handed you, and it tasted like someone had attempted to brew disappointment, but you drank it anyway because you understood on some primal level that the alternative was worse. Your stomach is making uncertain noises about the pottage. Everything smells. You are cold in that deep seeping way that happens when cold has been getting into you gradually for hours. Not the sharp cold of stepping outside for a moment, but the slow, relentless cold of a world that simply does not maintain the 68 to 72 degree ambient temperature you've been conditioned to expect as a baseline human right. But here's the thing, all of that, the dark, the smoke, the fleas, the cold, is just the surface level of your problems. The visible layer, the stuff you can actually perceive and react to. What's really going to get you is what you can't see. Let's talk about your immune system. Your immune system is in many ways a product of the world you grew up in. It has been educated, trained, calibrated against the pathogens it has regularly encountered. You've had vaccinations, which means your immune system has a preloaded response ready for measles, mumps, rubella, polio, tetanus, hepatitis, chickenpox, and a rotating selection of flu strains, among others. You've had minor illnesses throughout your life that your immune system handled, logged, and filed away for future reference. You have been, without thinking about it, systematically protected against a curated list of diseases that in other centuries would have been considered just normal parts of being alive. Now you're in a world where every single one of those diseases is running loose and completely unmanaged. Not in the dramatic, immediate sense. You're not going to drop dead in the next hour from smallpox. Disease doesn't work that fast, mostly, but you are now breathing air, touching surfaces, and occupying a space that contains a microbial landscape, unlike anything your body has been prepared for. And your body is going to start mounting responses to things it doesn't recognize. The average medieval village was a remarkably efficient pathogen distribution system. Dense population relative to sanitation infrastructure, shared water sources, no understanding of how disease spread, animals and humans living in close proximity, as we've established. Bodies buried in the churchyard right in the middle of the village, sometimes in shallow graves during periods of high mortality seeping into the groundwater. And the hands, oh the hands, the same hands that just fed you pottage from that bowl, may have, in the preceding hours, mucked out an animal stall, prepared a body for burial, handled raw meat of uncertain freshness, and scratched vigorously at a louse infestation. Not because these people are careless or dirty in any moral sense. They're not. They're doing the work of survival. But the concept of washing your hands between tasks to prevent the transfer of microorganisms from one surface to another doesn't exist, because the existence of microorganisms doesn't exist as a concept. Medieval medicine has a theory for how disease works. Several actually layered on top of each other in a fairly incoherent way. The dominant framework is humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine via Islamic scholarship, the idea that the human body contains 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health is a state of balance among these humors. Illness is an imbalance. Treatment, therefore, involves restoring balance, which in practice meant bloodletting, removing blood, often through venesection or leeches, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, which, to be clear, are already things your body is trying to do on its own right now without any encouragement, and dietary modification. If you get sick tonight, and your odds are not great, the treatment available to you will in almost every scenario make things worse. Let's say you develop a fever. Fever is your immune system doing its job, raising your core temperature to make the environment inhospitable to pathogens. It's a feature, not a bug. The correct response, from a modern medical standpoint, is rest, hydration, and occasionally medication to manage temperature if it gets dangerously high. What medieval medicine will want to do is bleed you, take blood out of your already stressed body to restore balance. This is the opposite of helpful. For most of the major diseases of the medieval period, plague, typhus, smallpox, malaria, bloodletting as a treatment actively accelerated patient death by weakening an immune response that was already struggling. There were also herbal remedies. Medieval herbalism was not entirely useless. Some plants have genuine pharmacological properties that have been validated by modern research, and the accumulated folk knowledge of healers was sometimes effective for specific conditions. Willow bark contains salicin, which metabolizes into salicylic acid, the active compound in aspirin. Some medicinal plants have genuine antibacterial or antifungal properties. But the diagnostic framework that determined when to apply these remedies was broken. You could be doing entirely the right thing for the wrong reason, or entirely the wrong thing for the right reason, and there was no reliable way to tell the difference. The healers available to you tonight are, in rough order of prestige, a physician, university-trained, rare, expensive, and mostly useful for wealthy patients in cities, a barber surgeon, a craftsman who does surgery, dentistry, and bloodletting, with more practical experience than theoretical knowledge, but working without anesthesia or sterile technique, a local healer or wise woman, variable skill, herbal knowledge, often genuinely helpful for minor conditions, also possibly about to be accused of witchcraft, depending on the decade, and local politics, or a priest whose medical intervention consists primarily of prayer and last rites. You probably have access to none of these tonight. You're in a peasant's home, and the best you can hope for is that whoever lives here knows which local plants help with a stomach complaint. Now let's compound your problems, because it's not just the immediate microbial environment that's a threat, it's the cumulative physical condition you're entering into. You haven't slept properly, you're cold, you've eaten questionable food, and drunk ale on an empty stomach. Your stress hormones are elevated, significantly elevated, because your body knows, even if your conscious mind is trying to stay calm, that something is very wrong about your situation. Cortisol, the stress hormone, suppresses immune function when chronically elevated, which means that even your existing immune defenses are operating at a reduced capacity. And here's something you probably haven't thought about yet: your teeth. Your teeth are going to be a real problem, not tonight specifically, but as a marker of how different your body is from the bodies around you. You grew up with fluoridated water, twice daily brushing, hopefully, regular dental checkups, probably orthodontic work at some point, and access to dental fillings, crowns, and root canals when things went wrong. Your teeth, whatever their cosmetic flaws, are fundamentally intact and functional. Medieval teeth, particularly among the peasantry, were not. The diet of a medieval peasant was high in coarse grains that mechanically wore down tooth enamel, and dental caries were prevalent. There was no fluoride supplementation, no modern dental hygiene, and no understanding of the connection between sugar, limited as it was in the medieval diet, but present in the form of honey and certain fruits, and tooth decay. Dental abscesses were common. A dental abscess, a bacterial infection at the root of a tooth, can, in the absence of treatment with antibiotics, spread to the jaw, then to the neck, then to the brain or the bloodstream. People died of toothaches in the Middle Ages, not metaphorically, actually died. Sepsis originating from an infected tooth is a real and documented cause of medieval mortality. The treatment for a bad tooth was extraction, performed by the barber surgeon without anesthesia, using a tool called a pelican or a dental key, in a context with no sterile technique. The extraction itself often introduced additional infection. People passed out from pain. People died during or after extractions from shock and blood loss. You are not going to have a dental emergency tonight, but when you look at the mouths of the people around you, and in the firelight you can catch glimpses, you are seeing a population with a relationship to dental pain that has been simply accepted as a permanent feature of adult life. Chronic pain from bad teeth was so normalized that it barely registered as a complaint worth mentioning. Let's talk about one more physical threat that is specific to this particular century, because if you've been dropped into the 14th century, and I mentioned that possibility at the start, there's a roughly 50-50 chance, depending on the specific year, that you have arrived during or around the time of the Black Death. The Black Death, the Great Mortality, La Peste, the single most devastating pandemic in recorded human history. It arrived in Europe from Central Asia via trade routes, reaching Sicily in 1347, and over the following 3 to 5 years, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire European population. Some regions lost 60%, 70%, even higher percentages of their inhabitants. It killed indiscriminately across social class, age, geography. It killed entire villages. It killed clergy and kings. It killed so many people so fast that burial infrastructure collapsed. Bodies piled up faster than they could be interred, which made things worse, obviously. The Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas on rats. Though pneumonic plague, transmitted person to person through respiratory droplets, also played a role in the death toll. It presented in multiple forms. Bubonic plague, characterized by the swollen lymph nodes, buboes in the groin, armpit, and neck that gave the disease its visual signature. Septicemic plague, a bloodstream infection causing internal hemorrhaging, and the characteristic blackening of the skin that gave rise to the name Black Death. And pneumonic plague, the lung form, which was almost universally fatal and spread through the air. The death rate for untreated bubonic plague is somewhere between 30 and 60%. Untreated septicemic plague is nearly 100% fatal. Untreated pneumonic plague is essentially 100% fatal. There is no treatment available. There is no understanding of the cause. Medieval physicians trying to combat the plague had no tools that worked. The miasma theory led to recommendations like burning aromatic herbs and avoiding bad air, which was useless against a bacterial infection. The religious framework led to flagellant processions where people whipped themselves publicly to atone for the sins that God was presumably punishing humanity for, which besides being medically irrelevant, actually helped spread the disease by moving infected people between communities. You are lying on a floor next to people who might have fleas that carry plague. You are in a world that has no antibiotics, no understanding of bacterial infection, no isolation protocols, no public health infrastructure, and if you're in the right, or rather very wrong decade, the plague is either coming, is here, or has recently been here, and will come again, because it returned in waves throughout the latter half of the 14th century. The fleas, which have been annoying you for the past hour, are no longer just annoying. They are a vector. I don't want to end this chapter on unrelenting doom, so let me offer you this. Medieval people were not passive victims. They were not stupid. They were working with the intellectual tools available to them, and some of those tools, practical quarantine measures developed in response to plague outbreaks, the eventual implementation of early public health boards in Italian cities, the accumulated botanical and dietary wisdom of healers, represented genuine human ingenuity in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. They survived. Obviously, they survived. You exist in some chain of descendants that traces back through these centuries. The species made it through, but you, specifically tonight, are a modern person dropped into a medical context that is genuinely pre-modern in every meaningful sense. Every system that keeps you alive at home. The antibiotics prescribed for a UTI, the blood pressure medication, the allergy pills, the glasses or contact lenses, the EpiPen for anaphylaxis, the insulin for diabetes, the antidepressants that regulate your neurochemistry, all of that is gone. Any chronic condition you manage with modern medicine is now unmanaged. Any latent condition that would be caught at your next routine physical is now invisible. You are not just a person in the wrong time. You are, medically speaking, a person walking around without a safety net, without a floor, without walls. Just you and the full biological reality of a pre-antibiotic, pre-germ theory, pre-everything world. And it's not even 2 a.m. yet. Chapter 4. The social minefield. Being a stranger in a world that hates strangers, you're still awake. Of course you're still awake. The fire has burned it down to embers. The family around you is in their first sleep, that early sleep period before the midnight waking. And the room is full of the sounds of people who are deeply, completely, almost aggressively unconscious. Someone is snoring with the commitment of a person who has never had any reason to question whether they snore. A child has migrated in their sleep and is now pressing cold feet against your back. The goat, if it's still in here, and it might be, is doing something in the corner that you're choosing not to investigate. And you're thinking about the broader situation, not just tonight. Though tonight is already going catastrophically by any reasonable standard. But the larger picture, because even if you survive until dawn, even if the ale didn't give you anything terrible and the pottage was fine, and the fleas were merely annoying rather than bacterially eventful, you are going to wake up in a world that is deeply structurally hostile to your existence as a free, autonomous, rights-bearing individual. And that's a different kind of threat than the darkness or the disease. It's slower, more complicated, and in some ways harder to explain to a modern person because it requires dismantling some very fundamental assumptions about how human societies work. Let's start with the basic social architecture of medieval Europe. Feudalism. You've heard the word. You probably vaguely remember it from a textbook. Something about lords and serfs and land and obligations going up and down a pyramid. And that's not entirely wrong, but the textbook version tends to flatten it into something abstract and historical feeling, when in reality it was a system of radical inequality that touched every single aspect of daily life, in ways that are genuinely difficult to comprehend from a modern standpoint. At the top, the king, or local equivalent, then the great, lords, dukes, counts, earls, who held land from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty, then lesser nobility, knights, minor lords, who held land from the great lords on similar terms, then free peasants, smallholders, artisans, tradespeople, who had some legal rights and somewhat more autonomy. Then, at the base of the entire structure, the unfree peasantry, serfs, villains, bondsmen, people who were legally tied to the land, who could not leave without their lord's permission, who owed labor to their lord, often several days a week, working the lord's fields before they could work their own, who were, in many meaningful legal senses, property. This is not metaphorical. Medieval serfdom was a form of personal bondage. A serf could not marry without the lord's permission, could not move to another village, could not pursue a trade in a town without buying their freedom first, and buying your freedom required money that most serfs simply didn't have. Their legal disputes were adjudged in the lord's court, which the lord controlled. Their surplus produce was taxable by the lord. Their children inherited their status. Serf children were serfs automatically from birth. You, wandering in from nowhere, are going to look like a runaway serf to almost everyone you encounter. Let's think about this carefully. You appeared out of nowhere. You have no documents, and literacy and documentation, while limited in the medieval period, still played important roles in establishing identity, particularly for travelers. A merchant carrying goods had bills of lading. A pilgrim had documentation from their parish. A nobleman traveling had letters of introduction. You have nothing. You speak in an incomprehensible way. You are wearing clothes that are wrong in ways that are hard to articulate, but immediately obvious. The weave of the fabric, the cut, the fastenings, the materials. Modern synthetic fabrics don't exist. Modern manufacturing processes don't exist. Even the proportions of clothing cut by a medieval tailor are different from what you are wearing. You are visibly wrong in a world that reads visual signals about status, origin, and belonging with extraordinary precision because visual signals are often the only signals available. Medieval people were, out of necessity, extremely good at reading strangers. In a world without ID cards, without central registries, without photographs, without any of the document infrastructure that modern society uses to establish identity, you assessed people through appearance, speech, manners, and introductions from known parties. You placed them in the social order using those cues. And once placed, your interactions with them were governed by that placement in very specific ways. The rules of address, for example, the expected level of deference shown to a social superior, the specific behaviors required of someone with lower status in the presence of someone higher. These were not optional. These were not things you could cheerfully ignore while explaining that where you come from, everyone is sort of casually equal, getting the social register wrong, speaking to a lord as though he were an equal, failing to show appropriate deference, using the wrong form of address, could get you into very serious trouble. Not how rude trouble. Actual legal physical trouble. And you will get it wrong. You will absolutely inevitably get it wrong because you have been raised in a society built on the premise that all human beings have equal inherent dignity and that nobody gets to legally hit you or imprison you for being insufficiently deferential. That premise does not exist here. Let's talk about the specific dangers of being an unidentified stranger in a medieval community, because I want to make sure this lands. Vagrancy. In the medieval world, a person without a fixed place in the social order, no lord, no parish, no guild, no visible means of belonging to a recognized community structure, was a threat. Not necessarily personally dangerous, though potentially, but socially dangerous, because they existed outside the networks of obligation and accountability that the entire system ran on. A vagrant was a person who answered to nobody, which meant that if they stole something or committed a crime, there was no lord to complain to, no community to hold responsible, no surety to pay damages. Laws against vagrancy existed throughout medieval Europe. The response to an identified vagrant varied by time and place, but options included being put to work, essentially forced labor, being expelled from the community, which meant being thrown back into the road with nothing in whatever weather was currently happening, being imprisoned, or in later medieval periods, being physically punished, branding, ear cropping, or flogging before expulsion. The specific brutality varied, but the underlying logic was consistent. You're not from here, you don't belong to this community, and therefore you don't have the protections of this community, and we can do with you roughly what we like. You don't want to be identified as a vagrant, but you also can't really avoid it, because you have no story to tell that would make sense to anyone. Let's run through your options. You could try to attach yourself to a religious pilgrimage. Pilgrims were among the most mobile people in medieval society, and a pilgrim traveling toward a major shrine had a recognized social role and some degree of social protection. The problem is that you don't know where the nearest shrine is. You can't communicate your pilgrim status verbally in any language anyone will understand, and you don't have the pilgrim's badge that would visually signal your status. You could try to appear to be a traveling craftsman or laborer, another recognized category of mobile person. But this requires actually having a skill that's recognizable and demonstrating it in some way. Your modern skills are largely useless here. Your ability to use spreadsheet software does not transfer. Your knowledge of how to drive a car is actively counterproductive. Can you do anything with your hands that a medieval observer would recognize as skilled craft? Most modern people, when they're really honest with themselves, cannot. You could try to find a church and claim sanctuary. Sanctuary. This is actually real. The legal principle of church sanctuary, the idea that a person who had reached a church could not be removed and prosecuted while within sacred precincts, was a genuine institution in medieval Europe, enshrined in both canon law and, in many places, secular law. Criminals, debtors, fugitives, and people in all kinds of trouble used it. The catch is, sanctuary was usually temporary. In England, the typical period was 40 days, during which the person in sanctuary could either surrender to the legal authorities or take an oath of abjuration, swearing to leave the kingdom forever and walking to the nearest port to go into exile. In practice, sanctuary was a way to buy time, not a permanent solution, and it required actually getting to the church, which means navigating the village at night, which we've already established is not going well. But here's a bigger problem with the church, which we need to talk about directly. The church is not an optional feature of medieval life. It is the entire operating system. I don't mean this spiritually or metaphorically. I mean it structurally. The Catholic Church in medieval Europe was simultaneously a religious institution, a governmental body, a legal system, a welfare network, an educational system, and the primary framework through which reality was understood and interpreted. If you wanted to exist in medieval society, legally, socially, economically, you existed within the church's structure. You were baptized into it. You were married in it. You were buried by it. In between, you observed its calendar, which structured the entire year into feast days, fast days, saints' days, and liturgical seasons. You paid it your tithes, a tenth of your income, mandatory, and you were subject to its courts for a wide range of offenses, including heresy, blasphemy, and sedition. The church was a and moral irregularities. And you are going to have a heresy problem, not because you secretly have heretical religious views, though for all I know you might, but because of what you know, because of your modern understanding of the physical world, which is irreconcilable with the medieval theological framework in ways that will become apparent the moment you try to communicate with anyone. You know the Earth is round and orbits the sun. You know about germ theory. You know about evolution, cosmological time, the existence of continents on the other side of the planet, the biological basis of pregnancy, the neurological basis of what medieval people might call demonic possession or divine ecstasy. If any of this comes out, if you somehow find a way to communicate even a fragment of your actual understanding of how the world works, you will be perceived as either insane, demonically influenced, or heretical. The Inquisition is real. Heresy is a capital offense. Burning at the stake was a real outcome for people who said the wrong things about religious doctrine, and the definition of heresy was broad. The enforcement of orthodoxy was serious, and the institution responsible for it had both the authority and the infrastructure to find you, try you, and execute you. You're not going to try to explain heliocentrism tonight. You're not going to try to explain anything tonight. You're going to stay very, very quiet and try to communicate through gestures and expressions that read as universally human. Gratitude, non-threat, exhaustion. But quiet has its own problems, because in a community where everyone knows everyone, and where gossip and social information are the primary currency of community life, a person who won't speak or who speaks in a completely incomprehensible way is automatically suspicious. Are they hiding something? Are they mute? And if so, what caused it? Was it divine punishment for some sin? Is this person cursed in some way? Are they a spy? Medieval communities were also, in certain periods, quite prepared to believe in witchcraft, not as a metaphor, as a real, operational supernatural threat in the world. Witches, people, usually women, believed to have made compacts with the devil in exchange for supernatural powers, were thought to cause illness in people and livestock, blight crops, cause impotence, induce miscarriage, summon storms. The great witch trials of early modern Europe are slightly after the medieval period proper, but the underlying belief system was already present and functioning. A suspicious stranger who appeared from nowhere, spoke strangely, and behaved oddly was in a zone of real social risk in this regard. Women reading this should be aware that this is not a gender-neutral danger. Medieval society had very specific, very constrained roles for women, particularly unattached women. Women who were not visibly daughters, wives, or widows under male authority. An unattached woman traveling alone at night was in a different category of danger entirely, one that we don't need to spell out in detail, but which is important to acknowledge. The protections that medieval law nominally offered women were largely contingent on their status within a recognized family or household structure. Outside that structure, those protections evaporated quickly. And for anyone in your traveling party who might present as a different ethnicity from the dominant local population, medieval Europe was not the ethnically homogeneous world that certain romanticizations would have you believe. There were Jewish communities. There were people of North African and Middle Eastern origin in Mediterranean Europe. There were Romani people, but the social conditions faced by these communities were genuinely dangerous in ways that varied by time and place, but were often extremely bad. Jewish communities in particular faced violent persecution throughout the medieval period, with pogroms occurring across Europe at various points, often triggered by accusations that had no basis in reality and fueled by scapegoating during periods of social stress. The Black Death, when it came, was blamed on Jewish people in a number of communities, with murderous results. So your social situation tonight is layered. You're a stranger without documentation, without language, without a recognizable social role, in a community structured around known social roles. You're either going to be absorbed informally into a household structure, which comes with its own obligations and risks, or you're going to remain visibly anomalous, which carries escalating danger as the night goes on, and more people have the opportunity to notice you and form opinions about what you are. The most important thing you can do socially is exactly what you've been doing. Stay quiet, show gratitude, make no sudden moves, and try very hard to look like a person who has a normal explanation for everything about them, even though you absolutely do not. The family whose floor you're lying on has so far not thrown you out. That's good. That's actually good. Medieval hospitality, as I mentioned, had genuine cultural weight. Turning away a traveler in need was not socially neutral. There are scriptural injunctions about welcoming strangers. There are stories, real ones, circulated and believed, about travelers who turned out to be saints or angels in disguise, and the spiritual peril of having failed to show them kindness. None of this makes you safe exactly, but it's a buffer, a thin one, but real. The head of the household is awake now. It's around midnight. The first sleep period is ending, and in the dim glow of the repoked embers, you can see someone sitting up. They're going to tend the fire, maybe pray, maybe check on the animals, and in a few minutes, they're going to look at the stranger sleeping on their floor and make some kind of assessment. What do they see? Someone who appeared out of nowhere. Someone dressed strangely. Someone who didn't speak but didn't cause trouble. Someone who ate the food and drank the ale without complaint and curled up in the corner and seemed, if not exactly grateful, at least not threatening. They see a problem they haven't solved yet. And when dawn comes, if you last until dawn, which is still not a guarantee, the problem of who you are and what to do with you is going to require an answer. Chapter 5. The Law. A system built to crush you. Let's say dawn is approaching. You've made it through the worst of the night. Barely. You're itching in 6 different places. Your back aches from the floor. Your throat is raw from the smoke. And your stomach is conducting some kind of internal negotiation that hasn't resolved itself yet. But you're alive, conscious, functional more or less. And as the first gray light starts to seep under the door and through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls, the household around you begins to stir. And with the daylight comes a new category of problem, because at night, you were mostly invisible. The dark was, paradoxically, a kind of protection. It kept you from being seen, assessed, interrogated, and processed by the social and legal machinery of the medieval world. But now the sun is coming up. People are waking up. The village is coming to life, and you are about to become visible. Let's talk about medieval law, not as an abstract historical subject, but as a living, operational system that is about to take an interest in you personally. The first thing you need to understand is that medieval law was not one thing. It was a patchwork, a layered, contradictory, overlapping collection of legal systems that coexisted in varying degrees of tension with each other. Royal law, feudal custom, canon law, the church's legal system, borough law, the specific rules of towns, guild regulations, local manorial custom, and the accumulated weight of tradition and precedent that didn't really fit into any formal category, but governed behavior nonetheless. For you, tonight, and into tomorrow morning, the most immediately relevant layer is manorial law. The law of the Lord. The manor was the basic unit of medieval rural administration. It was the Lord's estate, his land, his village, his peasants, his court, and manorial courts were real, functioning judicial institutions that met regularly to handle the legal disputes and administrative needs of the community. They recorded land transfers, settled disputes between tenants, enforced labor, obligations, collected fines, and managed the complex social business of a village. These courts were presided over by the Lord, or more usually, by the Lord's steward, acting on his behalf. And the Lord's interests were not incidental to the proceedings. They were central. The Lord was simultaneously the landlord, the judge, the chief of police, and in many cases, the legislator for the people under his authority. The concept of independent judicial oversight. The idea that a judge should have no personal stake in the outcome of a case simply did not apply here. And the Lord's steward, looking at you across the green of a village in the morning light, has already started asking questions. You're a stranger. You appeared overnight. You were sheltered, without permission from the Lord's perspective, by one of his tenants, and you have produced no documentation, offered no explanation, and cannot seem to articulate who you are, where you're from, or why you're here. This is a problem with a specific medieval legal shape. It's called being a suspected vagrant, and the mechanisms for dealing with it are well established. Let's run through what could happen to you in ascending order of badness. Expulsion. The mildest option. You're identified as a vagrant, not obviously criminal, not visibly diseased, just unwanted. You're told through gestures and raised voices and a pointed finger at the road to leave. You leave. This sounds survivable, and it is, in the immediate term. But you're back in the road. You're back in the medieval landscape with no food, no water, no shelter, no language, and no plan. The expulsion just reset your problem to an earlier state, detention for questioning. You're held in a lockup, or in a building under guard, or simply physically restrained by the stronger people of the village while somebody sends word to someone with more authority, while the community figures out what to do with you. Medieval detention was not the structured, rights-laden process you're imagining. There was no right to a speedy hearing. There was no requirement to charge you within a specific time frame. There was no lawyer. There was just waiting, in whatever space they put you in, until whoever needed to make a decision about you got around to doing so. This could be hours. This could be days. Accusation of a specific crime. This is where things get genuinely dangerous, because in a world where you can't explain yourself, accusations tend to fill the vacuum left by explanation. And the accusations that a medieval community might generate for a strange, inexplicably dressed, speechless stranger wandering in at night are not minor ones. Theft, trespass, vagrancy, which, as mentioned, carried physical punishment in some periods. Witchcraft, being in league with the devil, spying for a rival lord, being a runaway serf. Any of these are plausible interpretations of your situation from a medieval perspective, and once an accusation is made, the burden, such as it was, shifts to you to disprove it, which you cannot do because you cannot speak. And here's the thing about medieval standards of proof. They were not always what we'd recognize as rational evidentiary standards. Trial by ordeal, while formally prohibited by the Church after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, persisted in various forms in folk practice well into the later medieval period. Trial by combat existed, and compurgation, the system where you established your innocence by finding a sufficient number of respected community members willing to swear an oath on your behalf, was only useful if you had people who knew you and trusted you. You have been in this village for approximately 8 hours. You know nobody. Nobody knows you. Nobody is going to stake their immortal soul on an oath about your character. Let's talk about torture, because we need to. Judicial torture, the use of physical pain to compel confessions or testimony, was a real and legally sanctioned feature of medieval and early modern European law in many jurisdictions. It was more common in continental legal systems, which followed Roman law traditions, than in English common law, where it was technically not standard practice, though it happened anyway through various extra-legal channels. The logic was not simply sadistic, it was rooted in a legal framework that placed enormous weight on confession as the highest form of proof, and therefore saw coercing a confession as a legitimate means of achieving certainty in a case. The instruments used for judicial torture in medieval Europe were not things I'll describe in gratuitous detail, but they were effective at causing pain and injury and at producing confessions to things the person had often not done. The problem with confessions obtained under torture is that they're epistemically worthless. People will say anything to make the pain stop, but this epistemological critique was not available to a legal system that hadn't developed those concepts yet. You are not going to confess to anything because you can't communicate, which creates a different problem. The legal system needs a resolution, and a mute defendant who can neither confess nor deny is paradoxically in a difficult position. let me introduce you to a specific English legal concept: peine forte et dure. Peine forte et dure. Strong and hard punishment was applied to defendants in English courts who refused to enter a plea. The logic was that without a plea, a trial couldn't proceed, and without a trial, there could be no conviction. And without a conviction, the defendant's property couldn't be confiscated, which was an important consequence of conviction. The crown or lord got the property of convicted felons, so defendants who refused to plead were subjected to this procedure. They were laid on the floor, a board was placed on their chest, and weights were added to the board, gradually, over days, until either the defendant entered a plea or died. People chose to die this way rather than plead, sometimes because dying under peine forte et dure meant dying without conviction, which meant your property could be inherited by your family rather than taken by the crown. You won't be having that specific problem, since you have no property to protect. But the broader point stands: a medieval legal system encountering a defendant who cannot communicate is not going to simply throw its hands up and say, well, can't proceed, go free. It is going to find a way to resolve the situation that serves the interests of the Lord, the community, and the system. Those interests do not necessarily include your well-being. Here's another legal concept you need to understand: outlawry. An outlaw, in the medieval sense, was not simply a criminal. It was a specific legal status. An outlaw was someone who had been formally placed outside the protection of the law. Someone who had, usually through fleeing justice or failing to appear at court, forfeited their legal rights. The consequence of outlawry was stark. An outlaw could be killed by anyone, anywhere, without legal penalty to the killer. They were, in the phrase that English law used, caput lupinum. They bore a wolf's head. Like a wolf, they could be hunted and killed on sight. You are not formally an outlaw. You haven't been through the process that would make you one. But if you run, if you flee, before the steward has finished with you, if you're seen fleeing and the community decides to give chase, the practical situation has some uncomfortable similarities. You're a stranger, you're running, and the community's response to a running stranger they've already identified as suspicious is not going to be charitable. The physical geography of escape is also not in your favor. The open field system, the dominant agricultural organization of medieval European villages, meant that the land around the village was largely flat, open, cultivated strips, worked collectively by the village's inhabitants. Everyone knows every inch of this landscape. You do not. The paths, the routes, the shortcuts, the dead ends, the marsh ground that looks solid but isn't, all of this is completely opaque to you and completely transparent to them. You're not going to outrun anyone over terrain you don't know, especially after a sleepless night in which you've eaten and drunk things of uncertain quality. Let's come back to the immediate morning situation, because not every encounter with medieval authority ends in torture and outlawry. These are the extreme ends of the spectrum, and I want to be honest about the full range. Medieval communities also contained individual people with individual personalities, some cruel, some indifferent, some genuinely compassionate. The Lord Steward might be a pragmatic person who sees a confused, harmless-looking stranger and decides the most efficient thing is to assign you to a day's labor on the domain and send you on your way tomorrow. That's possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. The family who sheltered you might advocate for you in whatever limited way they can, gesturing, speaking on your behalf to the steward, making the case that you came peacefully and ate quietly and didn't steal anything. That counts for something in the ledger of medieval community assessment, and the church, specifically the parish priest, might take an interest. Priests were often the most educated people in a village, sometimes the only literate person, and they occupied a particular social role as intermediary between the community and institutional authority. A priest encountering a completely incomprehensible stranger might approach the situation with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Might try different languages. Latin was the lingua franca of educated medieval Europe, and if you've had any Latin education at all, unlikely but possible, even a few words might establish a different kind of connection. But even if the priest is helpful in a medieval context means something specific. It means you're placed within an institutional framework, taken in by the church, assigned a role as a laborer for the parish, expected to participate in the religious life of the community at every level. You are not free. You are supervised. You are watched. And any deviation from the expected behaviors of a Christian peasant in good standing with the church will be noticed immediately. You cannot miss Mass. Absence from Mass was both a religious failing and a social red flag. You cannot fail to observe the fasts, and there were many fasting days in the medieval calendar on which eating meat was prohibited, and observance was expected and monitored in small communities where everyone's behavior was visible to everyone else. You cannot be heard using language that sounds blasphemous or heretical, even inadvertently. You cannot express skepticism about any aspect of the religious framework, even through facial expression, in a context where people are watching you for signs of devil influence. It is exhausting just thinking about it, and you're already exhausted. There's one more legal dimension we should cover before leaving this chapter, and that's the question of debt and economic vulnerability. You have no money. Whatever currency you might have had on you when you arrived, paper notes, credit cards, a handful of change, is completely worthless here. Paper currency doesn't exist in most of medieval Europe. Credit cards are a form of advanced sorcery, and even a coin from a different regions or a later period would be immediately identifiable as wrong, which would raise questions you cannot answer. You are penniless. And in the medieval world, being penniless has specific legal and social consequences that go beyond just being hungry. A penniless traveler who accepts food and lodging and then cannot pay is in a complicated position legally. Medieval hospitality to strangers was partly charitable and partly transactional. Inns expected payment. Monasteries offering hospitality expected donations. Even private households offering shelter might expect some exchange of labor or goods. You have provided none of these. You ate the pottage. You drank the slept on is not wealthy. The food you ate, slept on is not wealthy. The food you ate was real food they needed for real reasons. The ale was brewed from grain that cost them real labor. If you've consumed their hospitality without contributing anything to the household, even a day's labor in the fields would go some way. You are, from their perspective, either a freeloader or a thief. And the line between those two categories in medieval law is blurrier than you'd hope. The morning is now fully arrived. Smoke is rising from hearths throughout the village. Animals are moving. Children are making the sounds children make when they've been awake for 5 minutes and are already fully operational. The field workers are preparing for the day. And the medieval workday starts early, genuinely early, because the daylight hours are the only productive hours, and you use all of them. Someone is going to ask you a question. Maybe the steward, maybe the priest, maybe just the head of the household you've been sleeping in, who needs you to either make yourself useful or get out of his house so he can start his day. And you are going to have to answer, in whatever way you can. Through gesture, expression, the few sounds you can make that might be recognized as human communication, even if not as comprehensible language. You're going to have to make yourself understood as at absolute minimum, not a threat, not a liability, not someone who is going to cause this community more trouble than the trouble of dealing with you. This is your immediate challenge. And your success at it, your ability to read the social signals correctly, respond appropriately, and fit yourself into a recognized social slot, is going to determine whether the rest of your time here is survivable or catastrophic. It's a hard problem. You're solving it tired, cold, hungry, itchy, with a stomach situation that is still not resolved, in a language you don't speak, using social codes you don't know, in front of people whose entire framework for understanding the world is fundamentally different from yours. Good luck. Chapter 6. The landscape of violence. It's everywhere, and it's normal. Let's step back for a moment and look at the larger picture. Not just your night, not just your village, but the medieval world as a physical and social environment, because there's a dimension of medieval life that modern people consistently underestimate, and it colors everything else we've been talking about. The medieval world is a violent place in a way that is qualitatively different from the violence of the modern world. I want to be precise about what I mean, because this can sound like simple medievalism. The idea that people back then were primitive and brutal, and we're enlightened and refined, which is both overly simplistic and self-congratulatory. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is more specific. Violence in the medieval world occupied a different position in the social and legal landscape. It was more present, more normalized, more immediately available as a means of resolving disputes, enforcing authority, and expressing power. And the institutional capacity to prevent or mediate it was far weaker and less consistent than anything a modern person has grown up with. Let's start with state violence, because that's the most structured kind. In the modern world, states have a monopoly on legitimate violence. The military, the police, the courts with their power to imprison and execute. Private individuals are not supposed to be solving disputes with weapons. We have institutions specifically designed to substitute for personal violence in conflict resolution. Courts, arbitration, mediation. When those institutions work, and they don't always work, and for some people, they work far better than others, let's not be naive. Violence is displaced into institutional channels. Medieval Europe had versions of all of these institutions. Courts, as we've discussed, a hierarchy of authority with the king at the top. A church that condemned certain forms of violence and tried to regulate others through mechanisms like the peace of God and the truce of God. Movements that attempted to limit warfare to certain days of the week and protect certain categories of non-combatants. These were real institutional attempts to manage violence. They were also profoundly, consistently, structurally insufficient. The king's law extended to the king's capacity to enforce it, which was limited by communication speed. A man on horseback at best, military capacity, which varied enormously, and the cooperation of the local lord, whose loyalty was a political relationship that could fray, fail, or be actively hostile. In remote areas, in border regions, in places where the lord was weak or corrupt or simply absent, the king's law was more aspiration than reality, and lords themselves were violent, not in a simple cartoon villain way, but the medieval aristocracy was a warrior class. Their social identity was constructed around martial virtue, the ability to fight, the willingness to use force, the personal courage that made them valuable as military commanders and defenders of their territory. Violence was not incidental to their identity, it was central, and their relationship to the law was not that of ordinary subjects. They were, in many ways, outside ordinary law, subject to different rules and different courts, and their capacity to commit violence against people below them in the social order was substantially protected by their status. Corporal punishment was entirely normal and socially accepted at every level. Lords beat serfs, parents beat children, masters beat apprentices, teachers beat students. Husbands, legally, had certain rights to physically discipline wives, the rule of thumb. Probably a myth in its specific form, but the general principle of permissible physical correction in marriage was legally recognized in various forms. None of this was shameful or secret. It was the expected mechanics of social discipline. Public execution was not just permitted, it was entertainment. Executions were public events, attended by crowds, sometimes planned around market days to maximize attendance. The methods were specifically designed to be visible and legible as punishment. Hanging, beheading, for nobility, burning at the stake, for heretics, breaking on the wheel, drawing and quartering for the highest category of treasons. These were not simply punishments, they were theatrical performances of power, demonstrations to the assembled community of what happened to people who violated the social order. Mutilation as punishment was common for lesser crimes. Ear cropping, branding, amputation of a hand for theft. These left permanent, visible markers on the body that functioned as social signals. That person has been convicted of a crime. Everyone who sees them for the rest of their life knows. The punishment didn't end with the physical act. It continued daily in every social interaction. This is the official, state-sanctioned violence. Then there's the semi-official violence. The feud was a recognized institution in medieval society, particularly in the earlier period. A feud was organized inter-family violence in response to a perceived wrong, a killing, a serious insult, a major property dispute. The church worked hard to suppress feuding. Secular authorities tried to substitute legal processes. And over the course of the medieval period, feuding was gradually pushed from a legitimate means of dispute resolution towards something illegitimate and criminalized. But it never disappeared entirely, and in regions where royal authority was weak, it remained a primary means of achieving justice in serious disputes. What this means for you: violence can erupt in a medieval community not just from authority figures enforcing law, but from private parties pursuing private grievances. Two families in a feud are effectively at war with each other, and being associated with either side, even accidentally, even simply by being in the wrong place, puts you in the crossfire of something you know nothing about and cannot navigate. Then there's the informal, everyday violence. Medieval taverns were sites of regular violence, not because medieval people were unusually vicious. The same things that cause modern bar fights: alcohol, insults, competition, sexual jealousy, old grievances, money disputes, caused medieval bar fights. But the medieval bar fight had a different character than a modern one because almost everyone in it was carrying a weapon. Knives were standard everyday tools carried by virtually all adult men, not as weapons specifically, as tools for cutting food, trimming rope, working materials. But a knife is a knife, and when a tavern argument escalated to physical confrontation, it escalated in the presence of blades. You're not in a tavern right now, but you're going to encounter men with knives. You're going to encounter this as a simple fact of the visual landscape. Knives on belts, knives on tables, knives being used for entirely mundane purposes around you all day. And you need to understand that the social rules governing when and whether those knives get used in anger are different from the social rules you're used to. Homicide rates in medieval Europe, as best as historians can reconstruct them from court records, coroners' rolls, and church documents, were significantly higher than modern rates in developed countries. Some estimates put them at 10 to 50 times higher, depending on the time, place, and social stratum. Medieval Oxford, for which we have unusually good records, had a homicide rate comparable to some of the most violent cities in the modern world. And Oxford was a university town. Relatively elite, relatively ordered. The difference wasn't that medieval people were more psychologically violent or had worse impulse control than modern people. It was a combination of factors: the absence of effective policing, the omnipresence of weapons, the weakness of legal deterrence, given how rarely perpetrators were actually caught and punished, particularly if they had social connections, and the cultural framework that in many contexts expected a man to respond to insults and injuries physically as a matter of honor. Walking away from a confrontation was not always a safe option. It could be interpreted as cowardice, which in turn affected your social standing and your ability to protect yourself and your household in future conflicts. Medieval warfare is a whole other dimension of this, and it deserves a moment of attention. Because medieval Europe was not at peace. It was essentially never at peace. There was always a war somewhere, between kingdoms, between lords, between the church and secular authority, between communities, between the very complex patchwork of principalities and fiefdoms that made up the political landscape. And medieval warfare was not conducted with precision munitions that minimized civilian casualties. It was conducted with armies of men moving across the landscape, living off the land, which meant eating the food that peasants needed to survive, burning crops and villages as tactical measures, and committing violence against civilian populations as a normal feature of military operations. The chevauchée, a deliberate military raid designed to destroy an enemy's economic resources by burning, looting, and terrorizing the peasantry, was a standard tactical operation used by Edward III of England in France during the 100 Years' War. among many others. It wasn't a war crime. It was a recognized military strategy. The goal was to demonstrate that the enemy lord could not protect his people, thereby undermining his authority and forcing him to either defend and thus meet you in battle, or capitulate. If there is a war anywhere near your location, and in 14th century Europe, the probability is not low. The possibility of armed men appearing on the road, hungry, violent, and looking for things to take, is a real and present danger that the community you're sheltering with is already aware of and already afraid of. The church tower in many medieval villages served double duty as a watchtower. The church bell, which rang the canonical hours and called people to Mass, also rang the alarm when strangers approached. You heard it last night. You didn't know what it was, now you do. Organized crime also existed, of course. Banditry was a persistent feature of medieval roads, the same limited law enforcement capacity that made personal violence difficult to deter, made organized robbery difficult to suppress. Medieval English legal records are full of cases involving gangs of armed men who robbed travelers on major roads. Sheriffs who were supposed to suppress them sometimes were them, or were in their pay. You need to travel at some point. You can't stay in this village indefinitely. The social pressure to move on, the uncertainty of your status, the lack of resources, all push you back onto the road eventually. And the road is where you are most vulnerable to all the forms of violence we've been discussing. Bandits, soldiers, aggressive beggars who have organized in certain areas into quasi-criminal groups, hostile locals who don't want strangers passing through their territory. Dogs, still a real threat, especially the large livestock guarding breeds used to protect sheep from wolves. Traveling in groups was the standard response to these dangers, and it's why pilgrimages, trade caravans, and other organized mass movements of people existed, partly as safety mechanisms. Chaucer's pilgrims traveled together partly for sociability, yes, but also because a group of 30 people with staves is significantly less attractive as a robbery target than a single confused traveler with nothing but a weird set of clothes and a haunted expression. You have no group to travel with. Let me give you one more dimension of this violence landscape that I want to make sure doesn't get lost: structural violence. The violence that isn't a single event, but a continuous condition. The labor obligations of serfdom were enforced through the ever-present threat of physical punishment and legal sanction. If a serf refused to perform boon work, the obligatory labor on the lord's land, the penalty was real and enforceable. The tithe extracted by the church took a tenth of what a household produced, regardless of how good or bad the harvest was, regardless of whether the household had enough to eat after paying it. Famine, the genuine catastrophic failure of the food supply, was not a natural disaster in a vacuum. It was a natural event interacting with a social structure that had allocated resources extremely unequally, that had no effective redistribution mechanism, and whose primary response to food shortage was often to continue extracting the same obligations from people who were starving. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, which preceded the Black Death and weakened the European population before the plague arrived, was caused by a series of cold, wet summers that destroyed grain harvests across northern Europe. Millions died, and in many places, the lords continued to extract what they could because they too were under financial pressure, and because the system had no mechanism for compassion at scale. You are, in the medieval world, not just at risk of individual acts of violence. You are inhabiting a system of structural violence that operates constantly, against which the individual has limited recourse, and which your modern political assumptions about rights, dignity, legal equality are completely unprepared to accommodate. The morning is bright now. The sun is actually out, let's say, and in the sunlight, this village looks less threatening than it did last night. The smoke from the chimneys looks cozy rather than choking. The people moving about their work look purposeful and human. The sound of children has a quality of ordinary life to it that is almost reassuring. But you know what? You know now. The darkness wasn't the most dangerous thing here. The darkness was just the part that was hardest to see. The real dangers are the ones that operate in full daylight, in front of everyone, sanctioned and normalized and woven into the fabric of a world that has been doing things this way for generations and has no particular reason to change. You've survived your night. Whether you survive your morning is a different question. Chapter 7. The Morning After. Why surviving the night isn't surviving, you made it. Technically, the sun is up, you can see your hands. The darkness that pressed against your face like something alive has dissolved into a gray, ordinary morning. Overcast probably because the medieval climate has its own opinions about comfort, and those opinions are mostly negative. But there is light. There is warmth beginning to seep back into the world, thin and provisional, but real. The birds are being extraordinarily loud about the sunrise, as they always were before the modern world muffled them with engine noise and glass. You are alive. This is not nothing. Let's acknowledge that. You navigated a medieval night without getting eaten by wolves, arrested by the night watch, stabbed by a bandit, poisoned by the water, or suffocated by that smoke. By the standards of the situation, this is a genuine achievement. You should feel something like pride. What you actually feel is terrible. Your body, which has been running on cortisol and adrenaline and the primal mammalian determination not to die, is now presenting its invoice. Everything hurts. Not in a dramatic injury way, in the deep, grinding way of a body that hasn't slept, hasn't eaten enough, has been cold for too long, and has been breathing smoke and stress all night. Your joints ache, your eyes feel like they've been lightly sandpapered. The flea bites, you counted at some point and stopped counting, are a low chorus of itching that you've learned to suppress but can't quite ignore. Your stomach has reached a kind of exhausted detente with the pottage and ale, but it's a fragile piece, and you have nowhere to go. This is the part that the premise of the video, why you wouldn't last a night in the Middle Ages, slightly undersells, because surviving the night is actually not the hard part in the end. The hard part is the morning, and the day after that, and the week after that, because you are not just surviving a night. You are trying to exist in a world that has no place for you. Let's be specific about what no place for you means, because it's the most important thing we haven't quite said directly yet. Medieval society was not just hierarchical, it was categorical. Everyone occupied a recognized category, a social role, a legal status, a named position in the community's understanding of how the world was ordered. You were a serf or a free peasant, or a craftsman in a guild, or a merchant, or a knight, or a cleric, or a noble. You were a daughter, or a wife, or a widow. You were a member of this parish, this manor, this guild, this household. You were baptized and recorded and placed. The category was not just social description, it was legal identity. It was the thing that determined your rights, your obligations, your access to courts, your protection from violence, your ability to own property, make contracts, testify in legal proceedings, and occupy physical space in the community. Without a category, you were not a person in any legally or socially meaningful sense. You were a void, a gap in the record. You are, as of this morning, a void. And voids don't persist in medieval society. They get filled by forced assignment to a category. You're declared a serf. You're put to work for the manor. You're taken in by the church and given a novice's habit and a cell and a set of obligations you never agreed to. Or they get expelled. You're put back on the road, literally pushed out of the community's boundary and left to be someone else's problem or no one's problem. The medieval social organism has a powerful immune response to uncategorized strangers. It either absorbs them or ejects them, and the absorption process is not painless. Let's say the most optimistic version plays out. The priest has taken an interest in you. He's a reasonably educated man. He has some Latin, he's read Aquinas, he has a practical pastoral personality that inclines him toward helping rather than condemning. He's decided you're probably not a witch. He's decided you're probably a traveler of some kind who's had a very bad time, lost, confused, possibly mentally disturbed in a way that deserves compassion rather than punishment. He's arranged for you to stay in the parish, sleeping in the church outbuilding, helping with physical work around the grounds, eating simple food from the charitable stores the parish maintains for just this kind of situation. It's not comfortable, it's not free, but it's survivable. You're warm, you're fed, you're not in a ditch. Now what? You can't stay there forever. Charity was real in the medieval world, genuine, theologically serious, socially practiced, but it was not unconditional, and it was not infinite. The medieval poor were divided, in the moral imagination of the period, into the deserving poor, the elderly, the disabled, the sick, widows with children, people whose poverty was clearly beyond their control, and the undeserving poor, the able-bodied idle, the vagrant, the person who could work but was choosing not to. Charity flowed toward the deserving. The undeserving were expected to labor, and the expectation was enforced. You're going to have to become useful. What can you do? Seriously, think about it. What skills do you have that are transferable to a 14th century agricultural community? Physical labor is the obvious answer. You have a body. The basic technologies of agricultural work, plowing, planting, harvesting, threshing, mucking out animals, carrying loads, cutting wood, don't require specialized training, though they require a degree of physical conditioning that you may or may not have. If you are reasonably fit and willing to do genuinely hard physical work for 12 hours a day, you can probably make yourself useful enough to be tolerated. Field labor during harvest was a period of maximum labor demand, and communities hired additional hands from outside. So there's precedent for absorbing a stranger into agricultural work temporarily, but you are not going to be a peasant farmer indefinitely. You don't have the deep embodied knowledge that a medieval peasant has from birth, which crops to plant in which conditions, how to read the weather and the soil, how to manage livestock through a winter, how to repair the tools, how to navigate the complex collective management of the open fields with all their strips and rotations and communal obligations. You're going to make mistakes that reveal you as a novice in ways that raise questions, and questions lead to the conversations you can't have. More specialized skills are worth thinking about. Do you know anything about metalworking, woodworking, textile production, leather goods, any of the trades, basic construction techniques? If you have any manual craft background at all, this is the time to lean on it hard. Craft skills were organized into guilds in medieval towns, which had their own barriers to entry, but outside the guild system, in rural areas, someone who demonstrated genuine skill with tools could find a niche. What about literacy? If you can read and write Latin, even rudimentarily, you are suddenly a person of significant value in a world where literacy is rare and the church runs entirely on documents. The ability to read a legal text, copy a letter, account for the manor's grain stores. These were specialized skills in high demand. A literate person who appeared from nowhere and presented themselves to a monastery or a cathedral chapter would be treated with considerably more respect and curiosity than a random vagrant. They would also be questioned intensely about their background, their education, their order, if monastic, their bishop, and your answers would be nonsensical and suspicious. But the skill itself buys you something. It buys you a different kind of conversation. Most people, if they're honest, don't have medieval applicable skills beyond physical labor. And physical labor is how you survive the first weeks, not how you build a life. Here is the real conclusion of your night in the Middle Ages, which the title promised but which took 6 chapters of context to fully deliver. You would not last a night in the Middle Ages because a night is not the unit of survival in the Middle Ages. The unit of survival is a life, and a life in the medieval world was a sustained negotiation with a set of conditions: environmental, biological, social, legal, spiritual, that required everything from you, all the time, without respite. It required the accumulated knowledge of how to do physical work that your body is not conditioned for. It required the social fluency that comes from being born into a community and learning its rules over decades. It required the spiritual and psychological framework that made the suffering bearable. The religious worldview that said this life is temporary, that suffering is meaningful, that there is a cosmic order, even if it's cruel, and that death is not an ending but a transition. Medieval people did not find their world unbearably hard, mostly. Not because they were tougher than you, not because they felt pain less acutely, not because they were somehow less human, but because they had no other reference point. They had no memory of antibiotics, no expectation of reliable electric heat, no sense that the world owed them a version of life that was easier than this. The things you find unbearable were to them simply Tuesday. Your tragedy, the specific tragedy of the modern person displaced in time, is not weakness, it's context. You know too much about what's possible and too little about what's actually available. You carry a mental model of what a human life should feel like that is completely incompatible with the conditions you're inhabiting. That gap between the world you expect and the world you're in is its own form of suffering that medieval people never had to bear. And there's one more thing, one final thing, which I've been building toward all night. You've been thinking about this as a survival challenge, a puzzle, a set of problems to be solved with sufficient cleverness and determination. And that framing is not wrong exactly. It's how modern people approach problems, and it reflects the deep optimism of a culture raised on the idea that problems are solvable, that situations are improvable, that human ingenuity applied with sufficient effort can change outcomes. Medieval people also believed in human agency, but they held it differently. They held it alongside a much larger, much more omnipresent awareness of the things that could not be controlled: the weather, the harvest, the plague, the Lord's mood, the king's wars, the length of a winter, the question of whether you and your children would still be alive in the spring. The emotional equilibrium that allowed medieval people to function in that context was not optimism. It was something more like a trained acceptance of contingency, an ability to hold the precariousness of life and still get up and do the work, still make jokes with neighbors, still feel genuine joy at a feast day, still love the people around you with full knowledge that they might be gone before the year was out. That equilibrium is also something you can't import. You have to grow it over years in exactly the kind of conditions that you have not had and would not choose. So here you are, mourning in the 14th century. The priest is looking at you with a careful, assessing expression. The steward is going to make his rounds by midday. The family whose floor you slept on is already out in the fields, because the fields don't wait. They never wait. They are the relentless fact at the center of medieval life that everything else orbits around. The sun is up. You are alive, and you are the most lost you have ever been. Not because of the darkness, not because of the disease, or the violence, or the legal system, or the social structures, or the language barrier, or the cold. All of those are real. All of those are trying to kill you. But the deepest lostness is something else entirely. You don't know how to be a person here. You know how to be a person in a world of information, of systems, of institutions that mostly function, of physical safety that's mostly reliable, of a life expectancy that trends toward the 70s and beyond, of identities that are multiple and chosen and fluid, rather than assigned at birth and fixed by God and Lord. You know how to be a person in the world that made you. This world didn't make you, and it has no idea what to do with you. Which, when you think about it, is exactly the feeling that history is supposed to give you. If it's doing its job, not nostalgia, not romantic longing for a simpler time, but a genuine, grounded understanding of how contingent everything is, how recently most of the things you take as baseline facts of human existence actually appeared, how much of what you call just how the world works is, when you look at it from the right angle, an extraordinary, fragile, historically unprecedented achievement. Indoor plumbing, antibiotics, anesthesia, the germ theory of disease, refrigeration, electric light, the concept of a weekend, the idea that children should not work in mines, vaccines, painless dentistry, the abolition of judicial torture in most of the world, the gradual, incomplete still contested extension of legal rights to people who didn't have them. None of these were inevitable. All of them were built by people who were, most of them, working without a full picture of what they were building, making incremental improvements on what they inherited, failing constantly, starting over, occasionally being martyred for it. The distance between where you are right now, medieval dawn, cold, itching, terrified, fundamentally unable to function, and where you were yesterday morning, making coffee in your kitchen with its reliable hot water and its electric light and its basic ambient safety, that distance is the distance that human beings covered, together, over centuries. It's worth knowing where you came from. It makes the kitchen feel different. It makes Tuesday feel different. That's what history is for. Chapter 8. What a good day looked like the human side. Let's stop for a moment, because I've spent 7 chapters trying to kill you, methodically, thoroughly, from every possible angle. The darkness, the disease, the law, the violence, the social machinery, the biological landscape, the structural cruelty baked into the foundations of the world. And all of that is true. Every word of it is historically grounded, and none of it is exaggerated for effect, which is the genuinely unsettling part. But there's something I've been leaving out, something that matters, and that the relentless catalog of horrors tends to obscure. Medieval people had good days, not despite everything, alongside everything, woven into the same fabric as the cold and the disease and the darkness and the feudal obligations and the ever-present smell. Real, genuine, fully human good days, the kind that stay with you, the kind that make the bad days survivable, the kind that are, when you get down to the bone of it, the whole reason anyone gets out of bed at all. I want to give you one of those days. Not because it cancels out anything we've talked about, but because history that only shows suffering is as incomplete as history that only shows triumph. And because understanding what made medieval life livable, what provided joy, connection, meaning, relief, tells you something important about human beings that the plague statistics don't. So let's say you've been here a few weeks now. The priest sorted out your status more or less. You're attached to the parish in some informal capacity, doing physical work, keeping your head down, learning the rhythms of the place through observation rather than conversation. Your language is still hopeless, but you've picked up maybe 40 words, enough to communicate basic needs, enough to make people laugh occasionally, which has done more for your social standing than anything else, because laughter is its own currency, and it crosses the language barrier better than almost anything. It's a feast day. The medieval calendar was saturated with feast days, saints' days, holy days, the great liturgical celebrations of Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and a rotating constellation of local and universal commemorations that meant the average medieval community observed somewhere between 40 and 60 non-working days per year on top of Sundays. These were not optional. They were mandatory rest from labor, mandatory attendance at church, and crucially, mandatory celebration. The church prescribed joy as a religious obligation on feast days. You were supposed to eat better, drink more, play, sing, and be glad, because the feast day was a foretaste of heaven, a temporal echo of the eternal celebration, and refusing to participate in it was its own kind of theological error. This is one of the great underappreciated facts about medieval religion. It didn't just demand suffering and penance and self-denial. It also demanded, with equal institutional force, that you enjoy yourself on the right days. Feasting was sacred. Music was sacred. Dancing, contested, occasionally condemned by overzealous moralists, but widely practiced and widely tolerated, was sacred in the sense that it was woven into the fabric of celebration that the church year created. So, feast day. And the village has been preparing. The smell is different today, and you notice it immediately when you step outside in the morning. Something is cooking that isn't pottage. There's meat, actual meat, not a bone boiled, for flavor, but real flesh on a fire, probably a pig slaughtered specifically for this occasion, because feast days were one of the primary contexts in which ordinary people ate meat at all. The agricultural calendar dictated slaughter schedules. Animals were killed in autumn before winter, because feeding them through the cold months was expensive, and because the fresh-killed meat could be preserved. Feast days were the moments when that preserved meat or a freshly killed animal on special occasions came out. The smell of roasting pork in a medieval village on a feast day would stop you in your tracks. People are dressed differently, not dramatically. Most of them don't have dramatically different clothes because clothing was expensive and most people had one good outfit for special occasions and one working outfit for everything else. But the good outfit is out. Someone has braided their hair with ribbon. Children who yesterday were indistinguishable lumps of mud are scrubbed and wearing their best things and vibrating with the specific energy of children who know something good is happening. The church service happens first. It's long by your standards and conducted in Latin that you can't follow any better than anyone else in the congregation. Latin was the language of the liturgy, and most medieval lay people understood no Latin at all, which meant that church attendance was less about comprehension and more about participation in a communal ritual, the physical act of being present and making the right gestures and responses at the right moments. You stand where others stand. You kneel when others kneel. You have learned enough of the shape of it by now that you don't stand out too badly. The church itself is the finest building in the village. This is almost universally true of medieval communities. The church was the largest, most solidly built, most decorated structure that most people would ever enter. Stone often when everything else was wood and thatch. Stained glass in the better examples, though your village church might have plain windows, glass being expensive. But even a modest parish church had color. Painted walls sometimes, depicting biblical scenes in bright reds and blues and ochres, candles on the altar, the golden gleam of liturgical vessels. After the visual austerity of everything else, the brown and gray of the fields, the blackened beams of the houses, the mud that is everywhere, always. The interior of even a modest church was a genuine sensory shock. It was supposed to be. It was a deliberate artistic and architectural statement about the difference between the earthly and the divine, designed to make you feel physically that you had crossed a threshold into somewhere else. You feel it. Even now, even knowing what you know about the institution and its complicated history, you feel it. The candles and the incense and the chanting and the painted saints on the walls. It works on you in some pre-rational way, the way great art always works, below the level of critical analysis. After the service, the village opens up. Games. This is what you weren't expecting, the sheer physicality and exuberance of medieval play. Modern people tend to think of medieval peasants as grim, laboring figures, bowed under oppression, and they were that, often, in the fields. But on feast days, they played with an intensity that makes modern recreational sport look restrained. Football, a chaotic, largely ruleless version of it involving an inflated pig's bladder and potentially the entire village on each side, with goals sometimes miles apart, was a feast day institution in medieval England. Wrestling, archery contests, running races, jumping, games involving sticks and balls whose exact rules have been lost, but whose energy has not. Children and adults mixing together in games that would, in a modern context, result in several injuries and at least one lawsuit. You watch from the edge for a while, and then someone, the blacksmith's son maybe, who has decided that the strange quiet foreigner is funnier than threatening, pulls you into something, a tug of war, something that requires no language at all, just grabbing the rope and pulling when the other side pulls. You pull. Your side loses dramatically. The blacksmith's son finds this hilarious. You find yourself, despite everything, laughing. It's a real laugh, surprised out of you. The first real laugh since you got here. And in that moment, standing in the mud of a 14th century English village, surrounded by people you can barely speak to, in a world that is trying to kill you in 16 documented ways, you feel something completely unexpected, present, not happy exactly, not comfortable, but present, connected, part of something happening right now in front of you, something entirely human. something that crosses the 700 years between your world and this one with complete ease, because it turns out that the experience of grabbing a rope and pulling and losing and laughing about it is not historically contingent. It's just what people do. The food, when it comes, is extraordinary. Not by modern standards, not in variety or refinement, but in what it means, the roast pork. Bread that's actually good bread, white bread, from finely milled flour that wouldn't appear on an ordinary table, brought out because today is special. Cheese. Onions cooked in fat. A kind of flat cake sweetened with honey that has been clearly made with care and intention and is absolutely the best thing you've eaten since you got here. Ale, better than the usual, brewed for the occasion, stored for it. People eat together. This is the fundamental social technology of the feast, the communal table, or the communal green, everyone eating the same food at the same time. The hierarchy softened slightly by the shared plate, the shared cup. Not erased, a medieval feast always preserved status, with better cuts of meat going to higher status tables, with deference paid and received even in celebration, but softened. The rigid vertical structure of medieval life had horizontal moments built into it, and the feast was the primary one. Someone starts to sing. You know this about medieval music intellectually, that it was everywhere, that it was the primary form of domestic entertainment, that people sang the way modern people play music through speakers, constantly and casually, and as a normal part of daily life. But knowing it intellectually and hearing it are different things. The song is nothing you recognize. The melody is modal, that distinctive sound of medieval music that sits slightly outside the harmonic framework your ears are tuned to, that sounds simultaneously ancient and somehow immediately moving. A man with a good, strong baritone leads it, and the others join in on the parts they know, which is most of them, because this is a song everyone knows, a song for this specific feast, a song that has been sung here every year for as long as anyone can remember. You don't know the words. You hum along in the places where the melody is clear enough to follow. Nobody looks at you strangely for it. At some point during the afternoon, you find yourself sitting beside an old woman, genuinely old, which in the medieval context means she's probably in her late 50s and has survived things that would have killed most people around her. She doesn't speak to you because she knows by now that it doesn't work, but she hands you something, a small piece of the honey cake, saved from earlier, offered with the particular deliberate generosity of someone who doesn't have much, and is giving it anyway. You take it, you eat it, you look at her, she nods, that's all. Just a nod, and you understand something in that moment that 7 chapters of historical horror had not quite managed to communicate, which is this: medieval people were not waiting for modernity to begin living. They weren't marking time in a holding pattern of suffering until the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution came along to give their lives value. They were living fully, completely, in the only way that was available to them and the only way they knew. And within that living, there was real joy, real connection, real meaning, and real moments of grace that required none of our advantages to be genuine. The old woman with her honey cake, the blacksmith's son, and the tug of war, the painted saints, and the candles, and the song in the modal key that your ears don't quite know how to resolve, but your chest somehow does. This is also history. It belongs in the record alongside the plague and the torture and the darkness. It belongs there because without it, you don't understand why people got up in the morning. And if you don't understand why people got up in the morning, you don't understand people. You are cold. You are itchy. You are still, technically, a void in the social record of the 14th century, a person without a category, a problem that hasn't been solved. Tomorrow the fields start again, and the cold starts again, and the relentless biological pressure of a pre-modern world starts again. The odds are still against you, and they will remain against you for as long as you're here. But today the pork was good, and someone shared her cake, and you laughed at a tug of war. And for a few hours in the middle of a medieval afternoon, that was enough. That was genuinely, completely enough. Conclusion: what the darkness teaches you. So let's come back to where we started. You opened your eyes. It was dark. The smell hit you. Something was burning in the distance, and you didn't know if that was good news or bad news. You know now. You know now that it was probably bad news, that most things in the medieval world tended toward bad news, and that the people who lived there had developed, over generations, a kind of radical fluency with bad news that you simply do not have and cannot fake. You didn't last the night. Not really. You made it to morning, technically, but you made it to morning itching, smoke raw, legally unidentifiable, medically unprotected, socially uncategorized, financially worthless, linguistically isolated, and already behind on the survival math of a world that has been calculating against you since the moment you arrived. And here's what I want you to sit with before you click away. The people who did last the night, who lasted thousands of nights, who were born into that darkness and lived and worked and loved and died in it without ever knowing anything different, were not lesser people. They were not simpler people. They were not people who mattered less or felt less or needed less. They were fully, completely, unreservedly human, navigating conditions of almost incomprehensible difficulty with a resilience that we have the luxury of never needing to develop, because they already did the work of building a world where we don't have to. That's the thing about history, that the dates and the battles and the kings tend to obscure. History is not a story about the past. It's a story about how the present got made. It's a story about the long, grinding, mostly anonymous labor of millions of people who solved problems they didn't fully understand so that their children might inherit a world fractionally less brutal than the one they were born into. They didn't know they were doing that. They were just trying to get to spring. But it accumulated, slowly, unevenly, with enormous amounts of backsliding and catastrophe and cruelty and waste. But it accumulated. The warmth you went home to tonight, the light you turned on without thinking, the water you drank straight from the tap, the fact that you will almost certainly wake up tomorrow without plague, is the accumulated interest on an investment made over centuries by people whose names you will never know, in conditions you would not have lasted a week in. That's not a small thing. That's everything. So the next time Tuesday feels hard, the next time the commute is bad, and the inbox is full, and the coffee machine is broken, and the world feels like it's pressing against your face in the dark, remember that you are standing at the end of a very long road that your ancestors bled to build. Remember the pottage. Remember the fleas. Remember the darkness that didn't have a switch. And then go turn on a light.